All right. Uh, Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll just give it a second as people are trickling in from the waiting room. But I am so delighted to see all of you here to talk about technology, the occult, the internet, rationalism, magic, and whatever else we can get to. So I have on with me two of my favorite writers about contemporary tech culture from a sort of ideological perspective. What is going on culturally? John Ganz and Max Reed, both of whom have incredible Substacks that I will be linking to in the chat. Unpopular Front and Read Max. Just a very, I mean, when that's your name, that is just the perfect, you just really were set up for success there.
Thank you, dear.
So I think that perhaps a way to start this conversation is by making a bit of an assumption, which is that many of you who are here, many people I've talked to in the tech world, in the sort of culture writing world, often will say something along the lines of like, we live in weird times. There is some kind of weirdness, hard to define, although we're going to try and define it in the next 55 minutes, about the precise way in which technological progress or seeming technological progress has gone hand in hand, not with a sort of vision of flourishing and the end of history and liberal optimism for all, but with a kind of combination of intellectual, cultural, and spiritual outcroppings of movements that in many ways seem perhaps either reactionary or atavistic or at the extreme end, slightly. And I know Max and John, both of you have written about that in various ways. So I want to start out by kind of inviting first Max and then John to kind of give us your 5-minute spiel. What is going on in the tech world and why are things so weird right now? So Max, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you for having me. First of all, I'm really excited to have this discussion. John and I have been talking about this sort of nebulous, interconnected thing for a while and been meaning to have a conversation. So it's really great to have a forum to do it in with an interested audience. I would say my perspective on this, or the perspective I try to sort of take, is a materialist one, which is to say, I'm a journalist by training. Is to sort of ask where the money is and where the money's been coming from and where it's going. And when so when I look at the tech industry and I look at the culture that sort of emerges around and in it, and I see a change coming, I notice that this change maps quite neatly onto a change in interest rates over the last 3 years. And I think, and look, I don't want to, I'm not like a hard materialist. Obviously, there's all kinds of interesting cultural ferment, and these are, there is an interplay between the intellectual history of these ideas and the sort of material history of them. But because I write a lot about VCs and a lot about sort of the executives, the managerial and investment class in Silicon Valley. I'm really focused on why people like Marc Andreessen, for example, have decided to fashion themselves as so-called effective accelerationists. A lot of people may have already read Andreessen's manifesto, the Tech Optimist Manifesto, which has a very, it's not my favorite piece of writing, but I think it's very revealing and sort of symptomatic. And it's super relevant to this discussion because a lot of it is to me, Andreessen trying to sort of refashion venture capital as this sort of mystical, sort of like quite literally sort of Nietzschean endeavor in which like he and his fellow risk-taking investors are refashioning the future for the benefit of humanity. And I read that, I believe that Mark believes this to some extent. Certainly he's spent a lot of time on Twitter and is very focused on the kind of EAC post-rat circles there, and has been I'm sorry to use such a pejorative word, sort of infected by this way of thinking. But I also think what's happening is that the kind of ways that he was able to raise and invest money that were easy and very possible in, say, 2017 have changed. There's, because of the change in interest rate, there's just less money flowing around. There's more pressure to get bigger returns. The software industry is in a state of change, both because it's hit a certain kind of natural ceiling, and also because it has been reliant on the froth of easy money going around. And I think he's noticed this, and I assume many VCs have also noticed this similar shift, and they're wondering where the money's going to next. And one guess, and this is me kind of doing a I wouldn't put money, like I wouldn't bet myself on this future, or even that this is what the A16Z sort of strategy is. But like a very easy and simple way to kind of square the circle on this is to say there's a lot more there's a lot of talk about industrial policy these days, and a sense that the state is going to invest a lot more money, or at least sort of direct money towards projects that it wants to see put together. And if your previous sort of idea was that you were going to fund like these Randian capitalists who were going to, themselves against the state build railroads or whatever, now the idea is you want to circle around like the Manhattan Project, like huge government funded, government directed, government structured projects that you can maybe get a piece of if you are saying the right things. And so there's like an obvious kind of contradiction there between how venture capitalists see themselves, how Andreessen in particular maybe sees himself, and like the idea that what you're doing is partnering with the state to direct money toward huge, industrial projects. And I think that techno-optimism as a kind of philosophy, such as it is, at least in the hands of somebody like Andreessen, is a reflection of that contradiction. The other thing I would say, because I think this is no small part of it either, is that and this is where the sort of semi-materialist, sort of semi-ideological part comes in, is as smart technologists, as smart software programmers and engineers and potential future founders themselves come under the sway, so to speak. And I keep talking about it like it's some awful Pied Piper thing, which I don't really think it is. But under the sway of effective accelerationism, of post-rationalism, of all the whatever you want to call the kind of nebulous, interconnected schools of thought that we're talking about tonight. You want to be if you want to get a piece of what they're doing, if you want them to take your investment, if you want them to come work at the companies that you're investing in, you want to seem like the cool guy who's part of that. So I also think, and John and Tara are going to talk about this too, part of this is the kind of money following where the ideas are and realizing that there's intellectual excitement about this. And, if you want the superstars to follow you, then you need to be talking a big game too. So that's my, from where I sit, the kind of stuff I write about, the kind of stuff I think about, that's my very shallow, I'm an English major, so don't make me fully explain what interest rates are, but that's my very shallow kind of glib understanding of the dynamic going on right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Max. Before, John, I ask you to weigh in, just a brief housekeeping. So for those of you on the call, which I should have done earlier, which is that we're gonna each say our piece. I have a few questions for the other panelists. There'll be some back and forth, and then around about 6:40 or so, depending on where the conversation is, I will invite questions from all of you. Feel free to drop questions if you have them as they come to you into the chat. We'll take that from there, and you will also have the opportunity to raise your hand and ask a question live, should you so wish it, in the question hour. But feel free to put questions in the chat as we talk, and we'll sort of start coming to those at the question time, and then move into other questions you might want to raise your hand and ask later. So thank you for your patience. John, over to you.
I have an account which is, I think, somewhat compatible with Max's, but a little different. I think what I was thinking about before we started this was that basically Silicon Valley as a sector of the economy has always never thought of itself from the very beginning as a normal business. It's always been an ideological project of some kind, and always conceived of itself as an avant-garde. And this once upon a time had kind of a left-wing balance where there, Pirates of Silicon Valley, there was a new left kind of opposition to bureaucracy, and we're kind of building these technologies of freedom, and this is going to create kind of new anarchistic communities. So there's always been a sense that among people in Silicon Valley, and it still exists, that they're not just another sector of the economy. They're not just, making products. There's some way building the future or building new ways of human being. And this manifests itself in many different ways. Like you have an intense focus by people like Steve Jobs on the actual, he was very focused on the design experience, and he was not, he said, this, we have to perfect this before we worry about, returns and profit, and that turned out to be a really brilliant business strategy. So I think there's a sense that these people think of themselves as transcending normal capitalists in a certain way. They're building the future. Capitalism has been good to them in the sense that they've provided huge returns. They've got giant investments. They've allowed to produce these projects. But I think, as Max was saying, is that some of those things are shifting, and their sense of their security of themselves as being at the absolute forefront of investment and what everyone wants to do is become a little shaken, which has created more of this effort to kind of build themselves up. But they've always had a vision of themselves as not being like bankers. And I mean, obviously there's a history, many industrials like Henry Ford in ways that are both kind of attractive and awful, conceived himself as not only building industry, but as a kind of model of society could be built up there. So I think that has always been baked in to Silicon Valley ideology. And I think as conditions have changed, both on the investment circuit and just politically, and they're a little bit less secure and less feeling so great about how the rest of society feels about this. And this leads to kind of defensive notions of themselves where they need to really insist. I think, they had a very close association with the Democratic Party for a very long time, and they were really deferred to. Organized labor is a little bit more powerful now. You have wokeness, quote unquote, which kind of, I think from the point of view of Silicon Valley capitalists, is this sort of like people who are in middle management and should really be in their place, kind of asserting themselves and making complaints that they shouldn't. So I think there's a sense that, the vision needs to reassert itself, and there is a kind of optimistic and there's a more reactionary version of that. So that's one thing I would say about it. I think one thing about that too is, and that's, very much of how things are changing in investment, how things are changing politically. But I think there's an intrinsic frustration in the type of products and production that Silicon Valley makes that leads it to this kind of cycle of having to create these ideological stories about itself, is that basically they're really focused on a lot of them are engineers. A lot of them, think of themselves as creating products that are going to create I revolutionize humanity, make things more convenient, have almost utopian things, and yet, and are really like concrete changes to human existence that are beneficial. And yet a lot of the things that Silicon Valley has accomplished, and I think, you see this in the frustration of people like Peter Thiel when he talks about what tech has accomplished, is very abstract. Like they've created more and more networks, more and more means of communication. But obviously we all have computers, but those in themselves are also getting kind of abstract. Like the Apple one time was like, oh yes, this is like a kind of extremely beautiful, useful project in the world, and you can hold it and see it, and it's useful and beautiful. But it's getting more and more intangible, especially with AI. And I think that leads to the need to fantasize that there's some outcome of this that's not just, losing more and more, I don't know what you want to call it, human connection, sense of reality, sense of actually doing something and not just creating more and more networks, less and less friction. So I think that creates to a lot of like the necessity to create these imaginative stories where they're not just, you know, creating more means of exchange, but they're actually, you know, creating radically new ways of human existence. And that leads, in one way, there's an extremely future oriented way of looking at that, and then there's this interest in the past, right? We'll talk about this interest in older societies and interest in the Middle Ages, interest in fantasy, interest in things that are more tangible, that have some human touch to them. So I think that there's some my only thing that I would add to Max's story, which I think actually kind of fits in with the investment picture, is that there's something intrinsically frustrating to the mind of an engineer who wants to create a new world about the kinds of products tech makes. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel a very I like going third because I can say I agree with both of you and yet want to add, which is the best possible scenario for us all. I know. I come at this. I'm a theologian, and I'm a sort of about to say an aesthete. That's not wrong, but that's not what I meant. I'm interested in theology and I'm interested in aesthetics. And I think for me, this is, in addition to being a material question, also a question of theology and aesthetics. And by which I mean, so when I first started covering this stuff, my first nonfiction book, Strange Rights, written in 2019, came out in 2020. I was interested more broadly in the sense that we are becoming less organized. America is becoming less religious by the standards of organized religion, even as the spiritual but not religious, the religiously remixed, the kind of internet-based, bespoke, create your own religion culture is becoming more and more prevalent. About 36% of millennials and younger say they, are not religiously affiliated. And against that background, I originally, and this is a thesis I want to update, identified among the kind of germs of potential new kind of religious, not quite religious movements, but ideological clusters, the techno-utopians, who I saw as sort of libertarian optimists about human potential, and separately the atavistic right, what was then the alt-right, that's a very sort of outdated term now. And my sense then was that there was a sort of like a sort of unlikely alliance between these two seemingly very different camps, this nostalgist, can we go back to time where men were men and women were women, and we ate raw meat, Jordan Peterson style, and the sort of let's all hack our brains and live forever, where the overlap to me seemed like it's an alliance against what they see as the social justice movement. It's purely pragmatic. They don't like the so-called wokes for, I think, the reasons that John, you've elucidated like very well. There is not just the sense of not liking wokeness as an ideology, but a kind of shared allergy to what both camps see as sort of Nietzschean slave morality or ressentiment, that there's these sort of mediocre people who are using mimetic power politics to stop the great people, the great men more likely, from doing the great things. Yep. And increasingly over the past few years, I think that what may have started as a sort of alliance of convenience has morphed, particularly with the sort of formation of the new right, funded as it is by so often, in many cases, by Peter Thiel, with the sort of presence of Curtis Yarvin bringing in the entire Dark Enlightenment and then neo-reactionary movement, a kind of shared sense that where I think the atavism and the forward-looking sort of, whether it's accelerationism or utopianism, ultimately have the same kind of narrative, which is that liberal modernity is this kind, with its inconvenient equality and its inconvenient senses of democratization, is somehow a kind of artificial meme that we've all been inculcated with, that is against the truth of the human condition. And this is sort of their words, or their ideas, not mine. But that somehow what we have lost in this disenchanted modern world is a sense of hierarchy and the importance of hierarchy to the possibility of greatness, that the pursuit of equality has held us back, not just from tangible technological progress, sending, space, more men to Mars or what have you, but to what it means to be human, that there's some kind of aesthetic thing of human life that has been lost. And this is something that is not new, as we'll get into in a second. They're sort of deeply rooted in the sort of, especially sort of Italian manifestations of aesthetic fascism. But it seems to me that this vision of the untrammeled self re-encountering an enchanted world is one that the old atavistic right and the sort of new techno-utopians share, where technological progress becomes the means by which the great people can be great. And I think a sort of additional element to this, and I know, John, you and I have talked about this before the call, so I sort of credit you for a lot of my thinking on this, but that there's, in the case of Peter Thiel, in the case of many of these figures, there is a sense that memes and mimetic ideas are powerful. Maybe they're the closest thing to reality that exists. And, those bad wokes infected the people with the bad memes, and we're the ones with the strong memes. And if we can kind of control the culture mimetically, we have certain kinds of power. And I think that conviction, which I think is ultimately quite a nihilistic conviction, that the culture shift is part that a lot of Thiel in particular seems to be about changing the cultures in order to have a control over a shared reality. And I don't want to get too much into the magical elements of that yet, but I've seeded this already. John, Max, how new is this? Where are some of the historical precedents for this kind of weird combination of atavism and forward-looking sort of technological fetishization?
Well, I think that the first thing, okay, so what is the commonality between these techno-utopians and the more reactionary people? I mean, you can kind of roughly say it's the sci-fi kids and the fantasy kids, but I don't know. That might not work. But I think it's basically both an interest in a worry about something concrete and something tangible. And I think where they often agree is race, where that both has a mystical and pack-looking thing, a historical aspect, and it's also scientific. It can be studied, genes. So I think that the race is one aspect of that, which seems to be both a rational and scientific category, but it's also a kind of historical and mystical category. And it provides an idea of concreteness and reality and social permanence. But the funny thing is what I was trying to say before is like, and I think what you were pointing out is that a lot of things they find frustrating, or a lot of things they find alienating, are results of the technologies that they themselves have created. And I think that they feel that they've lost control of. So, the prevalence of the ability of people that they feel are lesser to assert themselves, or just the general, idea of leveling that happens, is because we have all these networks and everyone's opinion is be able to be heard now. Communities can appear out of nowhere. Ideas that have no particular basis in reality can come out of nowhere and become dominant. So I think it's a struggle, as I'm trying to conceptualize this. I think in a weird way it's a struggle with the world that they themselves have created, because on the one hand it's brought them extreme wealth and it's brought them extreme social prominence, but it's also kind of brought the basis for, they once said, these are wonderful democratizing technologies. Now they're a little iffier about the technology, but the things they don't like, the things they find irksome, the things they find threatening, the medium by which it is expressed and which they learn about it is the technology they've built, and that's where it gets its power. So I think what they want to find is a form of concreteness, a permanence of their social role, but just social roles in general, class rule in general. And it has a scientific side, okay, the most intelligent people, and then there's a kind of mystical or medievalist side, which is let's recreate some kind of feudal system. They're kind of two ways of approaching the same core, but that's what I would say. And that has a long history in reactionary thought, which is reactionaries often like the parts of capitalism that are hierarchy creating, and productive, useful. Don't like the parts of capitalism that are hierarchy degrading, chaotic, create competition, new new social forces arise, new competitors can enter the social sphere, and there's not the same hierarchical divisions between things. So I think it's a very old tendency, which is just like, we want to keep the parts of capitalism that basically ensure our social place and are useful and are not alienating to us. So and you see this with the Teal is very obsessed with kind of like monopoly capitalism. Competition is bad. Competition is bad. Monopoly capitalism is the way to go. Well, who runs these monopolies? Well, me and my pals. So like, I think that's where the uniting link between these two groups is a search for the concrete in an increasingly abstract world that they've built. Yeah.
I would say, I think that's all totally correct, John. And I would add too that, part of what's at stake here is the result of like an earlier utopianism, that we, techno-utopianism itself has a long history that dates back, at least to like the Whole Earth catalog, and the sort of the important history of Silicon Valley, which I think often gets lost, depending on how you understand its politics, is that, it was a hippie world, but it was a really specific kind of hippie. And Fred Turner's work is really good on this, that it was not like, it wasn't really like, the new left. It was maybe, anti-war, but not from a Marxist perspective or even a kind of quasi-Marxist perspective, but in fact, from this like really deeply, and in my opinion, like extremely American libertarianism. And, I like the fact of its hippie aesthetics, I think allowed it to sort of take on the sense that it was left, and it was liberal in a way that was totally compatible with the left liberalism of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and even into the Obama era, and like really specifically compatible with Obama-esque liberalism. But the end product, as you say, has not really been precisely what I think a lot of the people who put this forward had really imagined. And there are plenty of people, I think Stuart Brand kind of loves the all that is solid melts into air part of capitalism. Like the Stuart Brand is like, he loves the market. He loves the weird shifting non-hierarchies. But obviously Peter Thiel and David Sachs and Elon Musk, and I could just keep listing South Africans, couldn't I? They really don't like this lack of hierarchy. And I think there's like I think that sort of that genealogy, the sort of like the utopian genealogy, part of what we see here is that, in some ways it's like because I think the Whole Earth guys, my dad is just a very normal like boomer into tech, was a subscriber to the Co-Evolution Quarterly, which was one of the post Whole Earth catalog publications. And when you pull out like magazines from now, I should have brought some so I could show them. It's all like the Gaia hypothesis, UFOs. It's like a fucking Joe Rogan podcast. Like it's like if Wired was edited by Joe Rogan. And like as a piece of kitsch, I love it because it's from 1985. I'm not feeling threatened by it or anything. It's like, it's great. It's fun. And that stuff still exists and is part of what we're talking about here. But there's also a way in which it's turned into itself, where it's less and less the case, or it's not always clear whether we can sort of code our way out of this, whether connecting these networks will make the sort of future that we think we want. And I think, just to connect it to one other thing you said, John, is I think the other thing that is sort of the through line that I see a lot is like an engineering mindset. Like there's a particular kind of way that I think is very different, I would say, from like scientists. This is not a scientific mindset, though a lot of these guys are very happy to be mistaken for scientists, that it's a tinkering mindset. It's an autodidact's mindset. It's do your research, like there's, and I like, for me, I don't know, some of that is to me like the most beautiful thing about the American character, but unfortunately it can lead you, it's not like a guaranteed way to make, good people or good politics. And so you end up with these kinds of, self-taught, do your own research, like clearly quite smart guys, or quite smart in really particular contexts, tinkering engineers, and entrepreneurs who upon like achieving the mastery that they've always sought are suddenly frustrated by what that actually entails, which is often like more politics. Exactly what they thought they were escaping was the sort of like the terrible antagonism that like political action entails, and then realizing once you get to the top of the heap, that's the only job you have. There's like nothing else to do at that point.
So I'm curious then about whether, and I'm going to just bring my conspiracy theory views to the forefront here. I'm inclined to talk about that mindset, or the way that I like to talk about the mindset is the mage or the magus mindset, in the sense of I think what links for me the sort of engineering mindset to this sort of religious dimension of Silicon Valley culture is twofold. It's a sort of Jamesian pragmatism about what spirituality or religion is or ought to be, that like one spiritual life is just something that you plug into yourself for your own self-actualization that doesn't necessarily have like a truth outside of your own experience. So it's just like, it's a way of hacking into your own psyche for productivity. And you see this particularly, I did a story for the New Atlantis about the post-rationalist community, about the way that rationalists and sort of Silicon Valley world had gone a bit woo and were interested in tarot and shadow work and what have you, where the kind of spiritual interest was largely about kind of psychological self-development. And I think that what interests me about the sort of mage mindset is, which is where I see like Thiel coming from, where I actually see Elon Musk coming from, as well as, you know, people like Brian Johnson, who with his sort of how much did he spend? $2 million a year in anti-aging? And he sort of boasts about being the next Jesus, the next Buddha, where the idea to me, the rhetorical move is something like this. My reality is based on either what I believe or what I can convince other people to believe, that there is no objective truth. We are, as Stuart Brand famously said, we are as gods and might as well get good at it. That internet, this early sort of Brandian counterculture, influenced as it was in many cases explicitly by like chaos magic and the Aleister Crowley to Austin Osman Spare pipeline, where you have these sort of anti-clerical, anti-establishment, proto-transhumanist celebrations of the human will, human freedom in a world where there is no other preferable source of reality. If we want to be a bit less woo in the lineage, we could also talk about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, major influences on a lot of people we're talking about. Andreessen's quoting Nietzsche extensively in his manifesto. And ultimately, it seems to me that the move is a sense that the people who are in charge of shaping reality, whether that be through specific technological innovation or through the use of technological innovation to transfer memes, as it were, in the case of whether it's social media or what have you, that reality is something that people who are smart enough to shape can shape. And I think that this coming up with a very real and I think understandable spiritual hunger, I'm completely with you there, John, that there is some search for tangibility, creates this sort of weird, not even an ambiguity, but like this oxymoronic situation where nothing is real, anything can be real if you convince someone that it is real. The way of asserting power is the creation of reality, but ultimately the pursuit is of a reality that cannot be ultimately attained. And you don't have to be a classical theist to be a moral realist, say. But I think that this sort of it's very difficult to dissociate the sort of reality as a field of power, where if you can either beat someone up because you're stronger than them, or you can have a bigger machine, or you can just convince them of stuff, where memes are just the latest field of Nietzschean power politics. And a sense that if we are indeed as gods, if there is nothing outside of our own human potential, our own creativity, this is in fact a perfectly coherent way of thinking about it. And so I'm curious how much you see the kind of spiritualized language of magic, language of the occult, language of kind of enchantment as playing a role either in the rhetorical ideology of a lot of these sort of higher level Silicon Valley figures, or in what the sort of person on the street in Silicon Valley, how they're thinking as a whole in terms of interest in this stuff as wedded to their interest in technological potential. Like I'm thinking of, Burning Man here, or Summit, or people who get really into psychedelics, et cetera, et cetera. So over to the both of you.
My tendency is to believe that it's part and parcel of their notion of themselves as having some kind of avant-garde mission, and some kind of that being some kind of elect. So obviously magical powers build into that fantasy very much. I think it also plays into the world-changing power, as you've talked about, the world-changing power of the technology that they build, and their frustration with being unable to control it. Marx's famous analogy that he used for capitalism and capitalists was, the sorcerer's apprentice, which is they kind of lose control over the things that they've conjured up. So I think obviously the traditions of magic and all these things that kind of imply the possibility of manipulability of the world, hocus pocus, and all this. I mean, they add both to the kind of narcissistic fantasies that someone who thinks themselves an elect would have, also to need for control, all these things, and also just because of the strange and kind of intangible and kind of seemingly spiritual aspect of the internet and technology. It's kind of in the mind and seems to be intangible. So I think that those things all kind of collide, and that's where the interest in. And the only one thing I would add to that is also, I just think that there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of neo-feudalism, and the magical stuff goes to medievalism. Teal loves what's it called, Lord of the Rings. A lot of these people grow up with that stuff, and the magic creates a world of hierarchy, and it's a real hierarchy. Some people have powers and some people don't, and some people deserve this and some people don't. So I think that these all sort of play into the I don't know, almost psychotic world that can be kind of created among people who are powerful and wealthy, and kind of view that as an end in itself. But I think also, I think something Anna said before we started was that at some point, once you have all the money in the world and you have all the power in the world, what do you do with it? And then you start to get this point where you kind of have to inscribe yourself into some greater notion. Like it's kind of Indiana Jones, right? So why do the Nazis need the occult objects? They need to inscribe themselves into some kind of order beyond order, right? There needs to be something even beyond, okay, you control the world, you've invaded everybody, you control Germany, but then it's not enough. And the desire for power starts to get into weird territory, which is not really tangible, arguably, I would say. I mean, I don't know if I really believe in this kind of stuff, but it gets into places where people, I think a lot of people, you see interest in magic among two sorts of people, right? You see them among people who don't have a lot of power and are at the bottom of the social order, and it provides an illusion of power. And then you see it at people really at the top of the social order, and it probably feels like what they have but want more of. But that's what I would say.
Yeah.
One final question I was gonna have a question for Max, but before I do that, after Max's next response, I'm gonna invite all of you to ask questions. I know, Anna, you've got your hand up, so start thinking if you do have questions. I'll be inviting them after Anna's in a second. So Max, do say what you were going to say, but I also know that you wrote specifically about sort of the neo-feudalism of the new internet landscape in your piece for New York Magazine. And so I'm particularly curious for you to address, in addition to whatever you're going to say as well, how the sort of combination of this sort of siloed, feudal new internet dovetails with, interacts with the seeming weird magical anarchy of the internet as a kind of epistemic mimetic playground.
Yeah, I think I can actually do all of it in one kind of answer. I think the first thing to say is that like the question of whether or not we're entering a neo-feudal economy from a late capitalist one is a kind of active debate, at least on the left. And I don't like I said, I'm an English major, so I'm kind of out of my depth, but I'm not convinced that the actual, in terms of like the forces of production and how they're arranged, that we are anywhere close to something that we would describe as a feudal economy. That being said, I think the experience of living a life that is largely mediated by internet platforms is sort of it's like an affectively feudal experience. Like it feels as though you are well, I don't want to literalize this too much. It doesn't quite feel like you're tilling the fields, owned by your Twitter fields or whatever, owned by your lord, but the sense that you are like trapped in spaces that you don't really own or control, that you are kind of an obligated servant in some ways. And I think this sort of affective sense is matched by all kinds of quasi-magical experiences. And I said some of the examples I use in the piece are like the way people they won't like type out Gamergate because they're worried that people will search the word Gamergate, which to me is like, it's not that different from the fact that the word bear is like cognate to the word brown, because ancient Germanic peoples did not want to say bear out loud because they thought bears would come and kill them. And there's like all kinds of like shamanic word stuff going on there. And so like it's like a little silly, and I think it helps remind us like, I still am of the school where like you can close the screen and walk away. Like you're really not trapped by this. But I do think that, what I was going to say in response to John before is like another part of it, I think, for people is kind of the simple fact that a lot of the people who are members of the post-rationalist community, say, or the EAC community, are people who have spent most of their lives and who continue to spend most of their time online, like mostly on Twitter and X, on Discord, maybe, whatever, places where mimetic power is the only power. And I think that I'm somebody who does this all the time. It's extremely easy to kind of mistake that sense that you can command the attention of people on Twitter with the sense that you are like doing something that exists in the real world. And it's not that Twitter is not real life. It's not that Twitter has no relationship to the real world. But, if you're, whoever these guys are, Basid Beth Jesus or whatever, and all of a sudden you've gone from like somebody nobody knows to a guy with a zillion followers, and these powerful Silicon Valley VCs are retweeting you and like copying your arguments, like you can start to begin to feel that the meme is the most powerful weapon you have to or for your cause. And so by all evidence, like, meme magic is real to these guys. And I think that, they're sort of missing the like lessons of the Trump era, which is that like meme magic is not really any match for like wine drinking lib resistance moms in Ohio or whatever, or, like blue collar voters pissed off about Dodds. And I think that, this is one of these things where the final thing I'll say is, John mentioned the way that magic is something that is always of interest to people sort of at the low ebb of power. And something I keep thinking about is the way that I'm sort of borrowing an argument about Foucault, that Foucault is increasingly, and sort of critical theory gets increasingly cited on the right these days. And I've seen people make the kind of glib argument that it tends to be the case that like people like Foucault, networks of power and kind of like the sort of just departing from materialist analysis is really popular when you're maybe when your power is waning, or when you don't really have power, you don't have the votes, so you have to talk about, like whatever it is, carceral states or whatever. And I think that's part of what's going on here too. Like I was saying in the beginning, that there's a shift in the political economy of Silicon Valley, and a recognition that it's not easy street anymore. And for some people, I think the sort of sense that there's like meme magic, whatever else you want to call it, that can be comforting, that it becomes an analysis that allows them some kind of power, or excuses them from being able to wield the power they want.
So Oh man, I wish we had so much more time than we do. And I think it is a useful corrective, I think, too. Like it does become easy to think meme magic is the only magic there is and memes are all there are. And I think particularly 2016 and the way that 2016 went down, I think has perhaps intensified that cultural sense in a way that may or may not be repeatable or true or normative. So before we get a question in chat, I know, Anna, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask the first question?
Yeah, but I will try to be very brief, and yeah, maybe this is more like an essay than a question. It's so interesting to me, and we talked a bit about these guys before you came in with the guests and Tara, how so many Roman emperors, dictators, business tycoons turn to some form of mysticism, and we assume that this is during their ascent to power, but in fact it's at the pinnacle. It's there where you get scared. It's also where you want to have a shared language with which to talk with potential followers and kind of like solidify your status. But I'm also, there must be this dread that, oh my God, there's nothing above me. There has to be somebody above me. I can't be the smartest guy in the room. But there's also something here that, as you guys were going through the different topics, I keep thinking about this meta question of, can there be good power, right? We have liberal democracies that somehow still enable enormous power to be accrued and exercised over other people. And we keep trying to figure out whether those values are compatible with liberal democratic values. And this is really, really hard. But at the same time, in my experience, people in power also question whether their power is good. And for instance, believing in, very Manichaean tales like The Lord of the Rings and, kind of like covering yourself in the power of the elves is almost positively juvenile way of dealing with this, to proving to the outside world that you're good because like you're on the side of Galadriel. So what can go wrong? And to me, this is just an interesting note to be kind of infantile Straussian, as they would probably also want and see the child in the tantrum, to kind of go back to Max's earlier point. Like, yeah, this tantrum is good. This tantrum is aligned with the with the good elves, with the good wizards. It's just, I don't know, probably if J.K. Rowling was less divisive, we would have a lot of Harry Potters in tech as well.
I'm curious about this. So I wrote a piece for RAP, The American Interest, years ago about this, but there is this sort of weird obsession with Campbell, Joseph Campbell, in the extended atavist tech universe. I think I've started calling them techno-vitalists, which is just a nice little shorthand. And I think what's interesting to me about the kind of interest in the like obvious answer is a lot of these people grew up nerds reading D&D and fantasy. Like that's the obvious answer. But I think the more conspiracy theory fun answer is that there is something about Campbellian visions of heroism as they've like entered fantasy fiction culture, which in turn, especially sort of 20th century fantasy fiction culture, where the idea that these sort of vague outlines of things, these vague narratives of, the boy hero can substitute for actual content, that if we are in a kind of Jamesian pragmatist universe where nothing is real and nothing means anything, then these shorthand sort of fantasy outlines, these Jungian archetypes, and Jung's another one that's big in this world. They're all the more meaningful because they're like the useful thing that you can use. And that there's a sort of functionalism to fantasy archetypes precisely because there's no sense of anything actually real. And I'll let the two of you tell me I'm wrong or not.
No, that sounds very convincing. I just thought this question here in the chat was interesting. I started paying attention to this stuff a few years ago, in part through following a history of religion eugenics that I was working on. That term hasn't come up, though. John started a discussion of race. How much of this quasi-magical, quasi-effort to direct society is distinctly about reshaping biology? What's going on there? Do these guys care about genes? I think a lot of them are really interested in eugenics and biology. And I think that, again, I would argue that there is some kind of homology or analogy, I get those confused, between the interest in magic and the interest in race and eugenics. I think that they both involve similar desire for concreteness. That's a desire for concreteness and reality, and also a possibility of manipulating, controlling that reality, which is what's interesting to these people. So I think that they're, you know, if we abstract very far away, I don't think there's a big difference between, I think, machinery, race, magic somehow are all categorically really on the same side of the of everything. And that's sort of like the things that they're desiring and they're going towards is like these categories that are, I mean, it seems silly to call them concrete because they're largely imaginary, but they have the feel or the aesthetic of concreteness, unlike, you know, the market or just being a, you know, living in on social media all day. So yeah.
I'll just add, just on a literal level, Thiel is pretty heavily invested in biotech. Sam Altman is a pretty heavy biotech investor. I mean, you don't hear about it as much because it's not quite as sexy as AI stuff, but it seems very obvious that, you know, you've heard the stories about Thiel and the vampirism. Like, obviously, there is some like quite literal interest in biology and genes and immortality.
This question that was asked is really interesting about science and the difference between science and engineering. I think that that's, and Tara brought up this earlier, is that the consciousness of engineers, the consciousness of natural scientists is different. And Max talked about this tinkering idea, is that, and you know, Henry Ford was very much this kind of person who was a tinkerer and had a workshop, and the shop was sort of like a large extrapolation of his kind of tinkering studio. Is that I think that they really believe that the practical application, you know, outstrips the theory in certain degrees, and that there's something superior about, you know, what an engineer is able to accomplish. And I think this is almost a magical thinking, which outstrips what, you know, the natural scientist can theoretically imagine. So I think that that's also a part of the engineer's mindset, is a highly elitist mindset and a highly, we can transcend anything, I can build a solution.
I would also add, I think there's a socialization aspect there where, I mean, I don't think I have to tell you this necessarily, but like being a research scientist actually requires social skills in a way that I think people don't respect or understand. That you have to be embedded in a particular kind of social world. You have to be able to deal with people. And not that engineers don't also have that requirement in some sense, but I think one particular kind of dynamic here is the sense that I couldn't, like you're talking about James, or you're talking about, right, James Lindsay. Sorry, I thought you were talking about James Damore, who is the Google guy, but I'll use him as an example anyway, where you sort of like, if you're just kind of an asshole and you just kind of piss people off all the time, there are many academics who are able to do this, but it's going to be a lot harder to advance in like a institutional environment like academia or research more broadly. And it's a lot easier to sort of strike out on your own as an entrepreneur or whatever. And so I think there is some level of like just sort of your ability to like put aside the shitty parts of your personality for like a couple days at a time and just like deal with other people in a way that doesn't alienate them, that maybe is also what's at a part of the engineer's mindset.
An engineer and a magician in their tower is a kind of solipsistic world, right? You know, and I think that that's also a point of comparison.
So we have time for one more question, and I want to, and this is from Nathan in the chat. I think this is a great one to end on. So Nathan asks, where does AI boosterism/doomerism fit into this post-rationalist moment? Is it a kind of eschatological myth or a counter-revolution to this intangibility, to ground consciousness into a materiality, to exercise the solipsism of online mimetic mysticism?
I think Max should answer that because you have such smart things to say about boosterism and doomerism.
That's very nice of you.
Yeah.
I mean, this feels like a question that could be its own hour. Like it feels like a question that we've maybe sort of danced around because we all know that it has its own thing. And I think you're right that it's like, it's right at the heart of part of what's going on, that both in the sense that this is the technology around which There's so much excitement. This is the technology that's the most obviously impressive, even to lay people, that there's something possibly genuinely as new and interesting here as there was as the early days of the internet. You know, I don't want to make too many assumptions. I don't want to buy into all of it, but that's obviously sort of where the energy is. And I actually think the answer to your question is both, or could be both. It seems really obvious to me. I mean, maybe too obvious, maybe it's too easy to slot into common sense to say that like doomerism and to some a certain kind of boosterism are essentially religious in nature. These are like, as you say, eschatological myths. The thing that I think is really interesting, counter to the second part of your question, is the extent to which a lot of post-rats and accelerationists, the tech vitalists, the techno-vitalists, I really love that coinage, are really, they love to tout the current unknowability of AI technology. I think the reason, like another sort of strain of this, or another thread to pull at in this movement, this sort of like broad community, is the way it's arranged around a technology that we actually are not entirely sure how it works, or how and why it works in the specific ways that it does. And like you can sort of see the obvious sort of medieval, mystical, magical kind of like ramifications of something like that we're all using something that is essentially magic. There's this guy on Twitter, Rune, who I guess works for OpenAI and has sort of become this shit posting AI influencer who's constantly talking about it as a kind of magic, as we put stuff in and something comes out and we don't know how it gets in there. And so I think that like, it's actually very attractive to people who think like this, people who are part of this movement, because of its continuing intangibility. And for me, like when I hear that from a group of people from an industry that just spent the last 20 years telling me there's no such thing as settled science, there's no such thing as settled opinion, we can find out anything we want to, everything you think is true is wrong. I'm like, don't bullshit me, man. We're going to figure this stuff out just the way we figured out everything else. But I can see like to the extent that we're probably years away from being able to like crack the hood of GPT-4 or whatever, to use some really glib language about it, and have a better sense of why it produces the kinds of results it does. Like, this is magic as far as they're concerned, and it's part of it. And I would just say, from a political perspective, this is also this is useful if you are reactionary, because you can embed all kinds of bias reflecting systems in other powerful systems without ever really having to account for how they come by their sort of opinions, so to speak. I mean, I'm not making a criticism that hasn't been made a million times before. And you could flip, I'm sure the right wing would flip that on me and say, well, you just want to like censor
wokeness in there.
Yeah, exactly. You made Grok woke or whatever. But I do think like I'm very interested in this, and I don't yet have anything beyond a sort of like a note about the kind of affinities there. I'm very interested in the ways that AI becomes attractive to people for its unknowability, and because of its kind of the ways that it's bigger than us. And I think it fits neatly in some of the stuff John was saying before, or it fits interestingly in some of the stuff John was saying before, the sort of Sorcerer's Apprentice aspect of this, the sudden, like, the desire to throw yourselves into the arms of technology that you don't understand, or you may never understand.
And I think it's sort of vital too to think like the sort of magic technology divide, as it were, is kind of illusory, historically speaking. I'm enjoying Nestor in the chat talking about proto-scientists and math and tech and AI, that there is a kind of historical, like, if we're going to define magic as like, at least in like the Western esoteric tradition, as opposed to like folk belief or what have you, so much of it is historically about sort of technology or human potential being harnessed for human ends. The idea that we are, because there's a kind of Prometheanism to it, of we are creating the tools and we are creating the framework within which these tools are used. We are deciding their purpose. And this is something you find in like early sort of Renaissance era magic tech folks, Francis, John Dee, later Francis Bacon in the New Atlantis, all the way onwards. There's always been, I think, this strand of this sort of mysterious thing that we don't quite understand that is magic. And this thing that is human technological potential sort of made manifest and I think, and this is sort of historically something we've seen, for example, in the 19th century, around the time of sort of the popularization of electricity, a lot of the like magical language was electricity was that mysterious magical current that was simultaneously the vibes out there in the universe and a kind of literalization of human creative power. And I see a lot of the language around contemporary AI and the kind of the sort of double movement of this is mystical and magical and out there, but also this is a kind of literalization of human power. That this ambiguity and this double movement seem to me to be like a pretty consistent element of the theorization of what magic and technology are supposed to be within at least like the Western esoteric magical tradition. You know, we becoming part of self-divinizing is literalizing our desire and will. And, you know, already, you know, electricity was doing a pretty halfway decent job about that. But anything kind of algorithmic in nature up to and including AI, I think takes that tendency, and I don't want to say takes it to as far as it can go, because for all I know, we could go further. I hope not, but it does seem to be, in my mind at least, an absolute literalization of the sort of divinization of human creative potential and human desire as a kind of, like, we're creating an egregore of it. And I'm, you know, sufficiently superstitious enough to think it will get us, but I don't know if it, is the like last question for me, because I know some people have to go, but you know, short answer: is the internet full of demons? Like, how scared should we be of the half-eaten apple? Is this all aesthetic vibes, or is there something to this kind of the magical and sometimes even Luciferian imagery in tech culture as a whole?
Well, it's not encouraging if they're into stuff like that. I think you know, what if they're you know, if people are really insistent on saying they're evil and they're, you know, it's like the are we the baddies skit where the, you know, they notice the skull thing. I mean, it's cause for concern. I would just say that, you know, along what you were saying, and I wish we had longer to discuss this. I mean, like, there's something because, you know, when I was preparing for this, I looked back at this, but I couldn't fit it into the time frame. It's like, you know, in dialectic of enlightenment, the whole idea is that myth is already enlightenment and enlightenment is already myth. These things are both wrapped up in each other. They're two sides of each other. There's no fully escaping the irrational. There is no fully escaping the imaginative into something, you know, that's totally rational, and there's no escape, and there's no, you know, going out of things that are somehow rational and directed at instrumental use of the world. So these things are both wrapped up in each other. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question. I would just say it's something to pay very close attention to, the way people's imaginations are going, is my, yeah.
I find myself, I mean, I'm usually a person who is very sort of chary of technology, and I'm a fan of crank theories of all kinds. I make a hobby and a habit of keeping track of them. But something about this moment and this group of people turned me into a high modernist. I just like, it's just a computer, man. It's just a fucking computer. I will say, though, quite literally, the internet is full of demons, because those are the little helper programs that do all the work online. So in some sense, yeah, it is.
Yes, it's interesting what they name things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun fact: Apple computers were first sold for $666. There is a half-eaten apple. And the thing is, I think that, like, and for those of you who are leaving, I won't be offended if you guys have to slip away. But I think it's and John, this is to your point. You know, it is possible to say not there's a secret bunch of Illuminati Luciferians who are made Apple, but that the mimetic imagery around knowledge dethroning a hierarchical deity is something that in the contemporary world is not sufficiently taboo that it won't make people buy the product, but also is part of a kind of wider contemporary ideology. And you don't have to sort of take it literally to take it seriously as indicative of a wider shift in a sense of the self's relationship to either the divine or what human beings should be.
I can buy it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's cool. So on that note, thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thanks for being part of Intellect. We do this a lot. I'm on usually twice a month with my favorite people who are willing to talk to me. There's many other things that are not me. Anna knows, the website knows. Anna, do you have any closing words you want to say about Intellect, or shall I say goodbye?
No, it was amazing. Thank you so much, guys. And I can't believe we fit this amount of information into 1 hour. That's a record on our platform. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. And I'm going to clean the video up, and it will go up on YouTube, so you can relive the experience and share it with your families.
Great.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
so much.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Anna.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.